this is our after lunch panel, and we're starting a little bit late, so if we go over 5 minutes, we have permission. But beyond that, the coffee will be waiting. So I'm really very delighted to introduce our speakers, and in particular, I'm very happy, although also unhappy, as you'll hear in a minute, to be introducing Raffaele Bedarida, now professor of art history at Sapienza Università di Roma, because he has been since 2016 my much honored and cherished colleague in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Cooper Union, where it was really wonderful to have him as part of our faculty. And we're all very sad that he left. And so our loss is Sapienza's and Italy's and gain, and our gain today that he is here. So Raffaele is an art historian. He's also a curator with a separate practice as a curator, specializing in transnational journalism and politics. And after many years at Cooper Union, he just joined as an assistant professor of art history, Sapienza. And his research, as you might gather, has focused on exhibition history, censorship, and propaganda under fascism and during the Cold War, very importantly, and has also worked on cultural diplomacy, migration, and exchange between Italy and particularly the US. And he has a really pretty extraordinary CV. His most recent books include Exhibiting Italian Art in the US, Futurism in Arte Povera, sorry about my pronunciation, Like a Giant Screen, 2022, and Curating Fascism, Exhibitions and Memory from the Fall of Mussolini till Today, co-edited with Sharon Hecker, also 2022, and again, I had the pleasure of seeing the exhibit that Raffaele curated in New York City about this project, Corrado Cagli, Transatlantic Bridges, 1938 to 1947, 2023. Those of us who went to the Mussolini's villa on our first day here saw some of those Cagli paintings. He's received grants from the Center for Italian Modern Art, that's where the exhibit was, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Italian Ministry of University Research, and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. I think I'm going to introduce everybody, and then we'll just move right on. We changed the order so that the first commentator is Mary Lou Roberts, who is the Emerita Wharf. I forgot to ask. Something. Okay, Research Fund, but more importantly, the Lucy Aubrac Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin, honoring the legendary French resistance heroine, militant. And her chair, right, was named after this legendary militant, who also started out as a history teacher, if I read that right. She, in 2020 and 21, she also held an appointment as military historian at West Point, which has something to do with some of the books that she has written, of which there are many. I'll just name two that have so influenced feminist historiography, certainly my own work, What Soldiers Do, Sex and the American GI in World War II France, 2013, and then absolutely foundational for gender and women's history, Civilization Without Sexes, Reconstructing Gender in Post-World War II France, 1917 to 1927. Really a classic book. And then our second commentator is Ofer Ashkenazi, who is professor of history and director of the Kobna Minerva Institute for German History at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and is about to embark on another visiting professorship or fellow at, actually at the Mosse Center in Wisconsin, in Madison. And Ofer has had multiple other guest appointments, notably as a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota. You might have heard something about that situation. And he is a historian of visual culture and has published 3 important books, A Walk into the Night, Reason and Subjectivity in Weimar Film, 2010, Weimar Film and Modern Jewish Identity, 2012, and Anti-Heimat Cinema, The Jewish Invention of the German Landscape. We'll see some of that. 1918 to 1968, 2020. And his most recent work, in addition to all the other books and articles, many more for Lou as well, has been on amateur photography by Jews in Nazi Germany, and that work is collected in a just published volume. I had the pleasure of blurbing it, just published volume co-written with Sarah Wobik-Segev, Rebecca Grossman, and Shira Miron, and it's really co-written, it's not an edited volume. Still Lives, Jewish Photography in Nazi Germany, just out from the University of Pennsylvania Press. With that, I will hand it over to Raffaele.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. All right, so thank you, Atina, for the generous introduction and for getting me involved in this wonderful program in the first place. I want to thank Sky and Donatello for organizing these events and for having me. As the only art historian, or almost only art historian here, I'm not going to discuss how the discipline has changed its approaches to art and fascism since the Stanford Seminar or since the 1960s, which would be too vast and probably not relevant enough in this context, but I will focus on exhibitions which stand at the crossroads between academic and public discourse and across disciplines. In particular, I will discuss big exhibitions organized in major institutions, which are interesting in this context because they are the product of a negotiation among multiple players and in particular scholars who are usually involved in the project, but also have a voice in the catalog. One of the things that I would like to emphasize is what is said in the catalog of the exhibition is not necessarily what the exhibition does to the public or with the public. The political choices made by institutions and the local administrations. Often exhibitions need funding, need approval by politicians, by museum directors, by trustees. The public responses through the press and media, more recently social media. Also, exhibitions activate collective rituals with the bodies in space, and those rituals again have in recent times a parallel life online through social media. Exhibitions give public visibility to objects, and art objects have a special status and a cultural prestige that is specific. And those objects are held in public collections, in private hands. They have a market, they have a story, and they are passed through generations. They are hidden, they are exhibited, they are stolen, they are sold, and so that's another aspect of specificity. I want to mention this book that was named by Atina because my paper today is the continuation of a teamwork, a team effort, and in particular I'm grateful to my co-editor Sharon Hecker, who's been my main interlocutor for years on this topic. In this book, scholars in many fields, historians, art historians, literature historians, architecture historians, approached exhibitions, discussed exhibitions that were held since the fall of Mussolini and dedicated to art and culture under fascist regime, And the book addresses shows held through the decades in various countries, in institutions of different kinds, using various curatorial approaches, and we identified strategies, we identified some blind spots, aspects and experiences of the fascist past that have been systematically silenced. We also discussed some models, some strategies that are more effective than others. Today, I want to focus on four major art exhibitions that, because of their large size, the influence of their creators, all of them are powerful, charismatic men. And the importance of their respective venues, they managed to catalyze public discourse on the cultural legacy of the fascist regime in ways that, as we will see, are not so straightforward. They influenced collective memory of the fascist ventennio. They contributed to shape, to a degree, cultural political awareness of the democratic present against the paradigm that the fascist past represented. This is one of the topics we've been discussing in these 2 days. These, of course, are not absolutely the only shows dedicated to fascism, but are arguably the most influential ones, which transcended the disciplinary boundaries of our history and entered public discourse. They also punctuate key moments when the legacy of fascism of the fascist regime was renegotiated vis-a-vis current events. And I will conclude, if we have time, with the coda on the current moment. An exhibition that was mentioned was the futurist one that is now in Rome. So the first example is 20th century Italian art, which predates the moment we are focusing on in this conference, and it's also not included in the book, Curating Fascism. It was held at MoMA in 1949, sorry. And it's especially important in today's context, as it documents how the view from the United States is a crucial one, and how the cultural diplomacy of the Cold War had a major role in shaping the way art of the fascist period was presented to the public and musealized. The show opened just 4 years after the fall of Mussolini, and just days after Italy became part of NATO. It was organized by MoMA's founding director, Alfred Barr, so a major influential figure, together with James Sobey, who was an important collector and a trustee of the museum, with the support of the Italian government, the newly elected Christian Democratic government. In the rhetoric of the show, after the fall of fascism, Italy was experiencing a creative rebirth, or as they said, and actually it became a media refrain, it was called a new renaissance that Italy was experiencing, which was well rooted in the pre-fascist past. And this was in line with Benedetto Croce, an influential philosopher and politician at the time, and his notion of the fascist parenthesis, the idea that something that happened to the Italian fascism was a deviation from Italy's nation-building process. And so in order to start rebuilding Italy, the Italians had to look back at the moment before the ventennio. The catalog cover, which you see here on the right, illustrates exactly that. You see an almost dead tree with the Italian tricolore, which has survived thanks to the roots, the strong roots, and it's sprouting new leaves. The exhibit, this was not acknowledged in the exhibition, but somehow the structure of the show emphasized exactly that. So there was pre-fascist contributions to modernism, which was now included in the MoMA's narrative of international modernism, in particular rehabilitating futurism. But what the show did was saying that the real futurism, the good futurism, ended with World War I, right? So there was no okay, there is an echo. So it started a myth that lasted for decades. An artist like Modigliani, which you see in the middle, and the Chirico. These are the artists that still, if you visit the permanent collection of MoMA, are present. But whereas Modigliani, who died in 1920, so 2 years before Mussolini's march on Rome, both the futurists and the Chirico were active throughout the Ventennio. Actually, futurism was influential, right, for the construction of a strategy and an ideology then embraced by Mussolini, and they were deeply compromised with fascism. It would take decades before that part of their work was addressed. Actually, the first museum exhibit in the United States to address futurism's long history until 1944, and its politics was held in 2013 at the Guggenheim. A show on the Chirico's involvement with the regime has still yet to happen. The other part, the second main emphasis in the show was to celebrate contemporary artists such as Renato Guttuso, which you see here on the left, Marino Marini on the right, as part of this rebirth of a creative renaissance. What the show did not say was that most of the contemporary artists in the show, Guttuso, Marino, and others, had thriving careers during the Ventennio and received support from the regime. They also avoided discussing the highly politicized artistic debate in post-war Italy. So, for example, Guttuso, who had joined the resistance after 1943, and then was currently in 1949 an engaged communist who had embraced Palmiro Togliatti's Italian Communist Party's stand against abstract art and in favor of socialist realism. The painting right here on the left was purchased by National Rockefeller, just to give you, and it was presented in a totally depoliticized way, although it's representing a farmer's struggle for the redistribution of land in post-war Italy. In other words, in order to rehabilitate Italian culture in line with the Cold War cultural political agenda, MoMA overlooked Mussolini's regime ambivalent relationship with modernism. Dismissed in the exhibition catalog as a largely reactionary phase, the Ventennio was in fact very well represented in the show. On that occasion, MoMA conducted a massive acquisition campaign, and by doing so, it integrated art produced under fascism and fascist art, to make that distinction Lorenzo Benaduzzi just made, in their permanent collection, and therefore in the most influential narrative of modernism. For comparative purposes, MoMA would wait until 1957 to hold a show dedicated to German art, and it had no art that had been supported by the Nazi regime. The impact of 20th century Italian art was immediate and deeply felt in Italy too. It was almost like a legitimization coming from the United States. And in the United States, the career of some of the top collectors, artists, and critics, Italian collectors, art and critics, was shaped by the interest and the market that this show stimulated there. So subsequently, many of these artists had successful careers in the United States, during which the narrative introduced by MoMA in 1949 was interiorized, performed, and negotiated. So again, this projecting and mirroring back to Italy was very important. The second show I want to discuss was was the first major exhibition on art of the fascist period held in Italy, and it was held in 1967, entitled Arte Italiana 1915-1935, and it was organized by our historian and critic Carlo Ludovico Raggianti in Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. It was a first reflection on a past that, historians, De Felice has started working on it, and for the 20th anniversary of the end of the war, there was a Mostra della Resistenza. However, there was not, in the art historical context, a real reflection on that until this point. Raggianti was an anti-fascist activist. He was part of the movement Giustizia e Libertà. He had been censored, he was imprisoned by the regime, and he coordinated the resistance during the Nazi occupation in Florence and in that area. And in a counterintuitive way, he actually chose an apolitical approach to the art produced under the regime, which in a way was also a reaction to the Mostra della Resistenza, but that we can discuss later. His exhibit amassed a huge amount of artworks by artists who had different relationships with the regime. So you had Guttuso, an anti-fascist, at least in a certain moment, next to Sironi, the most fascist artist at the time. And they were organized by purely stylistic aesthetic criteria, according to principles of what Raggianti called the puro visibilità, pure visibility, which he presented as a political choice. So one of the things I want to stress is the depoliticization of art and discourse on art was political, presented as political. In Raggianti's view, the ultimate approach to fascist curation was the 1932 exhibition Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, which was organized by the regime here in Rome, in Palazzo delle Esposizioni, to celebrate the 10th anniversary from the fascist power grab. This show was allegedly praised by the most prominent fascist curator, Margherita Sarfatti, as a show that did not exhibit the fascist revolution, but it demonstrated it. Mostrare ma non dimostrare, right? On the contrary, Raggianti decided that visitors had to be left free to respond and judge for themselves. And so, for example, here you see works by Jewish artists. On the left, Antonietta Raphael, on the right, Carlo Levi. Not only were their stories of persecution, censorship, and political activism left untold, but even the selection of the work based on purely stylistic criteria left out the pieces with more explicitly Jewish or anti-fascist content. For Raggianti, this was a non-prescriptive approach to curatorial practice, an exercise of open-endedness, of shared responsibility, and therefore of anti-fascism. That was an anti-fascist way of curating a show. The result, however, as we are going to see, was that art produced under the regime appeared as politically neutral, creating a problematic precedent for later shows. Also, Raggianti chose to forget, and this is something that happens in historiography too, that the fascist regime did not produce only propagandistic shows like Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, but also supported events such as the Venice Biennale, the Rome Quadriennale, which were integral part of the construction of consensus, especially in the 1930s, in which artworks were presented as autonomous aesthetic objects to be contemplated for purely aesthetic reasons, exhibited in allegedly neutral, depoliticized galleries, which later would be defined, called the white cube curation. These shows allowed artists stylistic freedom as long as the content of the work did not openly antagonize the regime. So here on the left, you see a futurist room at the Biennale di Venezia. On the right, you see the expressionist artists in the Scuola Romana, those that you saw in, at Villa Torlonia. So fascist Italy, again, to give a sense of comparison, did not have anything comparable to the degenerate art show organized in Germany. They also separated artists' personal life from their work, to the point that anti-fascists like Carlo Levi, again, who were persecuted for their political activities, participated in government-sponsored exhibitions while in jail or in exile. There is a famous story of Carlo Levi, who, the police goes to Carlo Levi's studio to arrest him, and he says, I have to finish my painting, and they let him finish, right? So there is this kind of reverence for the status of the artist and our practice. So if during the Ventennio this strategy successfully neutralized dissent, it made it invisible, and made most artists and critics complicit to a certain degree. After the war, it created a political alibi for most artists who had worked under fascism. So many artists would say, yes, but actually I was not in line with the fascist dictate. Their work did not really represent, right, the content, the slogans, the rhetoric explicitly of fascism. It also created a certain degree of interpretive freedom for generations of curators. My third example is the show Anni 30, dedicated to the decade of the 30s, curated by our critic and semiologist Renato Barilli. Barilli was a professor in Bologna in the school of Umberto Eco. This happened in Milan in 1982. Is one of the first blockbuster exhibitions, we would describe them this way, in Italy. It was held in Palazzo Reale next to the Duomo in Milan, as well as in public locations. So in Piazza del Duomo, in Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, and in subway stations. The exhibition claimed to challenge cultural hierarchies between fine and applied arts, and emphasize the continuum of cultural production across the boundaries of the art museum. So it was not just about the hierarchies between fine art and applied art, between graphic design, industrial design, and painting, for example, but also the idea of working in the public space. Which somehow recognized that in the fascist precedent as something important. Barilli, and this was probably the most interesting, important intuition, even emulated some curatorial strategies introduced in propaganda shows of the 1930s, especially the arches of the 1934 Esposizione dell'Aeronautica, designed by architect Luciano Baldessari, like therefore identifying exhibitions as an integral part of that continuum. Barilli understood that the exhibition was an important medium mastered by the fascist state to create consensus. The result, however, as some reviewers noticed already in 1982, was that the show was immersive, was overwhelming. So Barilli's curation did not encourage visitors to historicize the cultural product and exhibition strategies of the regime or distance themselves critically. This extremely popular show was accused by some critics to spectacularize the fascist past or even to cast a nostalgic gaze onto the Ventennio in line with the conservative turn that Milan's administration took in the early 1980s. This was the period of lottizzazione. In the catalog you have one essay by a socialist critic, one essay by a communist, one essay by a Christian Democrat, the same way public television was organized at the time, right? So there was that kind of approach in a moment when Milan was the center of socialist cracksism, which maybe we can discuss later. Now, the 1930s were identified as the point of origins of a luxury industry that by the 1980s had turned Milan into the capital of Made in Italy national branding. So there is this moment of identifying the fascism as a moment when that idea of national identity started to be built. And my fourth example, of course, this is a very short and synthetic discussion of the shows, is the exhibition held at the Prada Foundation in Milan in 2018. It was entitled Post Zhang Tung Tum, so it inspired by Marinetti's 1914 poem, inspired by, in turn, the battle in Adrianapoli. And the subtitle is interesting, is Art, Life, Politics, Italia, 1918-1943. And in fact, visiting the show was the starting point for my and Sharon's reflection and the project for our book. Not unlike Barilli, here the curator, Germano Celant, claimed that to treat art in the context, he claimed to treat art in the context of life and politics during the period, as claimed in the title. And he did so by staging the artworks as they had been exhibited during the Ventennio. So in some cases, the exhibition evoked environments based on archival documentation. So as you see here, this was the initial room. The living room of Marinetti, the leader of Futurism, was evoked through a painting by Boccioni, which is in the collection of MoMA, but also a vase, a ceramic vase by futurist Tullio Dal Bissola, as they were pictured in a photo of a performance by Marinetti. Here you see in this was also the poster promoting the show. Here Marinetti was doing a demonstration of fascist cuisine. The gender dynamics of this picture was not addressed in the show. However, I think it should have been. So the idea was that this would would be a different approach against the white cube context of the MoMA exhibit. In other cases, archival photographs of the biennales or other shows of the period were inflated and turned into three-dimensional environments in which some of the original art pieces were included. This would be a futurist show. There was also all sorts of other documentary materials included in the exhibition. Celant described it as a show of the showing or an exhibition of exhibition. He therefore claimed for himself a neutral position, but he said the show curated itself. The idea is that the curator puts the documents to the public fruition, and then it's up to the public to make an idea for themselves. He actually did another exercise in what he called transparency. There was a room with the books used by the curatorial team to prepare for the show, so that the public could flip through those sources. Like Raghianti, he embraced the idea of mostrare senza dimostrare that I was discussing earlier. The big difference then was generational and historical between 1967 and 2018. Raghianti and his public had a direct experience of fascism, most of them. Raghianti knew very well who Carlo Levi was and had the direct knowledge of his anti-fascist activism within Giustizia e Libertà. Raghianti, as I said, was part of the movement. And they could decipher the paintings. So, for example, the one here that was exhibited in both exhibitions was entitled The Chinese Hero. And it was a coded portrait of fellow Giustizia e Libertà militant Aldo Garosci, while Levi and Garosci were in exile in Paris. And it was done in such a way that it could be exhibited in Italy under the radar of the fascist censorship. So Guttuso would say, I saw that painting in the Quadriennale in 1931, and that was a sign, right? It was this kind of secret handshake to understand what this kind of Chinese hero was speaking Chinese only to those who could understand, right? What the Chinese language. However, when Celant exhibited this painting, and by the way, it's a sandwich between Adolfo Wild, Saint Lucy, and the super fascist De Pero, futurist De Pero, right? So the context is important. When this was exhibited in 2018, most of the public would not even know what Giustizia e Libertà was, who Garosci was, let alone understand how this painting spoke different languages to different people. So again, if you make the documents available, how does curation provide the tools for the public to decipher those documents? So ultimately, the Prada show, which claimed to be a contextual approach, neutralized dissent as the regime had wished for, I would say. The show, nevertheless, was internationally celebrated by the press and attracted large crowds. Reviewers mostly appreciated the abundance of documentary material and the immersive nature of the show. The New York Times reviewer described the experience of visiting the show as walking into fascism, which to this visitor felt strange. I walked into the room dedicated to 1938, and as an Italian Jew, there was no reference whatsoever to the racial laws, just to make an example. Also, visitors were seduced by the beauty and desirability of the artworks. And the seduction is something that came up during these days. This seduction was further expanded by the sleek curation of the Prada show. The guards were wearing Prada suits. The colors of the walls were directly related to the aesthetic of the fashion brand. Only months after the show opened, some very few critical comments emerged. One by Rosalind McKeever, and another one I'm making here is Esther Cohen. They objected against Challen's claim of what he called in his essay in the catalog a real and contextual history. And they they pointed out that the exhibition, in fact, failed to represent the reality of violence and oppression that the fascist regime meant for many. Critics pointed out how the same beauty and seduction that made the Prada exhibit so successful was the same beauty and seduction employed by the regime propaganda machine. And another important thing is that Esther Cohen was an author in the catalog. Like many other authors of catalog essays, Marla Stone, Romy Golan, they wrote those essays, and then when they visited the show, they were shocked and they felt the need to take a distance. So again, what the show does to the public is not exactly what the original project was. Unlike Raggianti's show, which was made by an anti-fascist activist for a public that had largely experienced the fascist regime, the Prada show happened in a historical moment when fascism is, for a large part of the public, an overused rhetorical device, but it's also an all-too-present political reality. The show opened in the middle of Trump's first administration, 2018, and a day before Italy's political election, which was the moment when Matteo Salvini rose to the fore. It opened in the branded space of the Prada Foundation in a historical moment when Italian fashion brands started to celebrate their Italianità, as well as their historical roots in the interwar period by inhabiting the spaces and embracing the aesthetic of fascist modernism. Here you see the Fendi headquarters, which was moved to the UR, and on the right is the movie, the House of Gucci in Villa Necchi. In the 1930s was the house of Alessandro Pavolini, fascist minister. Now, how do we situate a claim of neutrality in a show where archival documents are made available, but at the same time they are manipulated, they are photoshopped? In particular, I was interested in the juxtaposition of black and white photographs and artworks in color, which introduced an editorial gaze. Somehow can be compared to what Schindler's List did with the girl with the red coat. Of course, Schindler's List was all about the camps. That show did not present that reality at all, but still it made the authority of the historical document live through this emotional, affective emphasis. And I think the most interesting part of the show was that artworks here functioned less as autonomous object than as indexical references to situations and people from the period. So for example, here was the room dedicated to 1942, where sculptures by Arturo Martini were presented the same way they were exhibited at the Venice Biennale that year. Then flipping through the catalog, you realize that that's the same way the artworks had been seen by the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, when he visited in Venice. And so in a way, the work reflects back our act of looking. Celant emerged as the theorist of arte povera. You have, Pistoletto is all about mirrors that show you in the act of looking of images. So seeing ourselves impersonate Goebbels, Mussolini, the interwar Italian public, we realize that this is the same public that saw and caused the collapse of parliamentarianism, the fascist power grab, the enactment of the racial laws, all the way to the disaster of World War II. So questions of spectatorship were not addressed directly by the curator, but if we read the show as a question mark, then we can find avenues for new research and curatorial approaches. And that was the idea of curating fascism. Now, I realize that I don't have the time to go through the more recent exhibitions, I just encourage you to go and see the Futurism show. Tomorrow we will hear more about it, so I guess I can skip this. I just want to end with some questions for this group. First is, most exhibitions relegate the critical question to scholarly catalogs, which are usually overlooked by the public. And so if we consider the language that curation use, how do we curate a show that raises difficult questions rather than neutralize and depoliticize their content? Secondly, I want to ask, unlike books or even movies, exhibitions are collective rituals involving our bodies in space and choreographing, facilitating a unique kind of encounter with original objects, with their aura, with documents, and also that encounter is shared with other people. So how do we make the best of such experience, of the specificity that an exhibition represents, and how do we raise awareness about the responsibility of looking, of spectatorship? Finally, art exhibitions tend to attract a wider audience and to catalyze public discourse much more than historical exhibitions or memorial. This is something that historian Robert Gordon discusses in Curating Fascism. So how would historians, and I want to pose this question to this specific group, how would historians use artworks and material culture produced under fascism to address the most urgent issues they deal with in their scholarship? Thank you.